My name is Evan Hale. I'm 34 now, the owner of a modest logistics firm that somehow survived its first brutal winters and learned how to bloom. Most evenings, I unlock the front door of a small house that smells like coffee and cedar, and I feel the kind of quiet that doesn't accuse me of anything. My friends come by on Fridays. We cook too much, laugh too loud, and stack our phones in a bowl so nobody can disappear. If you met me today, you wouldn't guess the place I came from or the door that made a sound I can still hear in my bones. At 19, I learned what a sentence can do to a person. My father, Lionel, stood at the threshold with his arms crossed like a padlock and said I was drag dead weight, the sort of ballast a ship jettisons when the weather turns ugly. My mother, Marina, didn't shout. She rarely did. She pressed her lips into a polite, practiced line and added that maybe pushing me out would teach me the current. It was late, too late to be anyone's son, and the hallway light made the dust look like slow snow. I walked past them with a backpack that didn't even rattle. People ask what it was like growing up there, and I stumble because the easy words strict tough aren't honest enough. My father ran import-export on paper and something harder to name in the shadows. He was good at sounding right. He found fault like other men found weather on their phones. If I brought home a B, he made it a punchline. If I brought home an A, he made it a forecast of future failure. My mother called herself a peacemaker, but peace in our house meant silence purchased at my expense. "You know your father," she'd whisper, as if fathers were hurricanes and boys were supposed to apologize for standing on the coast. They loved my younger brother Cole in the way you love a plan that confirms itself. When he passed his driver's test, a used sedan happened to appear. When I practiced, my father asked what the point was if I couldn't afford gas. On one dinner time that still glows a little too bright in my memory, I slid my first paycheck across the table like proof that I could be real in the world. $56 and change from bagging groceries until my shoulders ached. My father barely glanced. "You want a ribbon?" he said before turning to Cole and lighting up about the business like a man praising a mirror. The first betrayal wasn't loud. I had been folding small bills for months, a quiet envelope kept behind a stack of thrift store paperbacks. Community college wasn't a dream so much as a door I could try, and I loved it for that. One evening, the envelope was gone. I checked the floor, the wrong drawer, my own pockets, like maybe I had become careless without noticing. When I asked my mother, her face froze the way a lake does, still and dangerous. "Your father needed it," she said, as if need were a locksmith. "It's family money." That was her phrase. Family money. It turned all the hours I had traded for cash into a duty I had apparently owed the whole time. When I confronted him, my father didn't deny a thing. He called it an investment and said I'd thank him when it paid off. The joke was that it already had it bought a little more obedience. A few months later, I learned he'd opened a credit line in my name. The letter arrived with my name bolded like an accusation and talked about a missed payment I had never made. My mother smoothed the page with her palm the way you soothe a child. "It's nothing serious," she said. "Your father's handling it?" He laughed when I brought it to him. "Paperwork is paperwork," he said. "Don't act important to paperwork." It took something out of me. Not just the savings and the thin thread of a plan. It hollowed a space behind my ribs where trust should have lived. The house became narrow. Words were traps, silence was debt, and even sleep felt means-tested. I learned how to carry myself like contraband. The night he threw me out, my father didn't look like a criminal or a tyrant. He looked like a man who had decided a story's ending and was impatient for the credits. He came into my room without knocking. He never knocked and dropped a stack of forms on my desk. My name ran across the top line of every page like a forged signature that hadn't yet happened. "Sign," he said. "You don't need to understand it." I pushed the papers back. "No," I said. The word sounded smaller than I wanted, but it was the first honest sound I had made in months. He went quiet in the way storms do right before the roof comes off. He called me ungrateful, a parasite, a boy who thought menial work made him a man. I laughed not because anything was funny, but because the air needed a crack in it. I said the words I'd been stacking in my mouth for years, that he had taken my savings, that he had borrowed my name without asking, that every time I reached for respect, he moved it farther away. My mother stood in the doorway like a coat rack holding nothing I could use. When he told me to get out, she nodded. "It's time you learned how the world works," she said, as if the world were his trademark, and he was finally licensing it to me. I packed what I owned in minutes because I didn't own much: a gray hoodie that still smelled like fryer oil, a secondhand MP3 player with a cracked screen and a playlist that made sense to exactly one person, a toothbrush, and the sort of hope that looks a lot like stubbornness when you squint. At the end, I turned, not because I expected anything, but because my body remembered how to check a room for a last kindness. My father held the door. My mother looked past me like there was something interesting on the wall. Behind them, Cole lounged on the couch and didn't stand up. I stepped onto the porch. The night had the kind of cold that argues with your breath. When the door closed, the sound was ordinary wood, meeting wood, metal greeting metal, but it traveled. It went down my spine and settled somewhere I hadn't known was empty. The first nights, my car became geography. I learned where the parking lot stayed unbothered, which side streets fell asleep early. Fast food turned into a diet you could name if you wanted to lie to yourself. Jobs showed up one at a time, unloading trucks with men who spoke in syllables and kindness, sweeping a shop floor while engines worried the air, stacking shelves until labels filled my dreams. The world did not in fact work the way my father did. A manager said "nice job" once, and it felt like someone had put a floor under me. But all of that belongs to the chapter that came after the door. What matters for now is the way I left, not as a son fleeing, not as a disappointment exiled, but as a person with a refusal in his mouth and both hands free. I didn't yet have the map. I didn't yet know that logistics could be more than boxes, that systems could be dignity, that a paycheck could do more than keep you alive. I only knew that I would not sign away my name again, not even to keep the heat on. I slid into the driver's seat, pulled the hood over my ears, and stared through the glass until the porch light blinked off. My phone didn't ring. There were no apologies on back order. The silence felt like an open field. Somewhere, a delivery truck shifted gears. Somewhere, a diner dragged its last chair onto its last table. And somewhere inside my chest, a door different from the one behind me eased open without making a sound. I turned the key. The engine caught on the second try. Tomorrow, I told myself, I would find work that paid in real hours and not in humiliations. Tomorrow, I would buy coffee with money no one could rename as family. Tomorrow, I would begin the long, unglamorous climb toward a life that would not need anyone's permission to exist. And for the first time in a long time, I believed me. The car taught me a map no GPS shows. I learned which supermarket lots went dark after midnight and which churches didn't tow if you tucked yourself beneath the elm. I learned that condensation writes your name on the windows and that a folded hoodie can almost be a pillow if you tell your neck a kind lie. Mornings smelled like antifreeze and paper cups. Nights were a seminar in hunger. Work arrived in fragments. A dock foreman needed hands at dawn to catch pallets that came in like weather. A mechanic paid cash to have the bays swept until the concrete remembered its color. On Tuesdays, the warehouse called when a truck was late and the schedule went crooked. There's a rhythm in other people's urgencies. If you learn it, you can dance for a few dollars at a time. The first day I could afford more than gas station food, I walked into a diner where the vinyl seats were cracked like old maps. I ordered eggs and toast and coffee that tasted like someone had argued with a burnt pot and lost. The waitress called me Han without asking my name. When the plate landed and I ate at a speed I hoped didn't look like desperation, something subtle shifted. It wasn't joy. It was control, the quiet knowledge that I had traded hours for this, and nobody could rename that trade as family money. After a few weeks of that rhythm, I found a room above a barber shop. The landlord showed me the space like an apology: one window, a hot plate, a bathroom barely bigger than its mirror. I said yes before he finished his speech. The first night I turned the lock and just stood there listening to the absence of voices. Silence is a muscle. You learn to carry it. At the warehouse, I started staying late, even when nobody asked. Work like that is supposed to be all back and no brain. But that's a lie people tell to feel superior. Freight has its own logic. If you set the fast movers on the near aisle, you save steps and reduce repicks. If you stage by route drivers, stop teaching the air how to swear. If you label in a way a tired stranger could understand, you cut your own future headaches in half. I asked questions. I watched the screens in dispatch the way some people watch sports. I learned that a misscanned barcode at 8 a.m. becomes 3 angry emails by noon and a chargeback by Friday. I learned that efficiency isn't a trick, it's 1,000 tiny respect decisions made for people you'll never meet. One afternoon, a manager named Rita caught me reslotting a section nobody had told me to touch. "You got a reason for moving my coffee pods, Hale," she said, squinting like I'd stolen a crown. I explained my thinking as carefully as if the words were glass. She watched, then nodded once. "We'll check the metrics next week." When the pick times fell, she handed me a clipboard and a schedule for a lead shift. It wasn't a throne, it was a rope. With the extra 50 cents an hour, I signed up for a weekend course that taught me how to make spreadsheets talk. At night, I read about root density and cube utilization until the numbers began to smile back. I took a forklift certification because nobody can argue with a laminated card. I wasn't chasing prestige. I was learning the grammar of a world where promises arrive on time, or they're not promises at all. Outside of work, I gathered people who didn't ask me to apologize for existing. The barber downstairs, Luis, tapped his broom against my ceiling when the playoff game got good and yelled for me to come down. A nurse on the 3rd floor left a casserole outside my door with a note that said, "Return the pan or else." We ate on my floor once because I didn't own a table. Somebody spilled salsa and we laughed like it had been the plan. It wasn't a family, not in the way people put on Christmas cards. It was better. It was chosen. Sometimes my phone showed me photographs I didn't mean to see, cousins around a table, candles turned to a flattering angle, my old house peeking out behind their smiles. Someone told me my childhood room had become my father's study. I pictured my posters gone, the paint the same, a desk where a boy used to breathe. The feeling that rose wasn't jealousy. It was clarity. You can replace furniture. You cannot evict a person and keep their story. By 24, I could buy groceries without counting as a sport. I moved to an apartment with 2 rooms and a balcony that believed in sunsets. At work, Rita pushed me into scheduling, then into ops. I built a board that laid out our week so plainly even Mondays blushed. I spoke up in meetings and didn't feel like I had borrowed the right. When a driver retired, he hugged me in the break room and said, "You made it make sense." It was the compliment I had been chasing without having words for it. The years turned. I stopped flinching when a number unknown lit my phone. I passed my old street sometimes out of muscle memory and watched the house shrink in the mirror. I began to understand that anger is a kind of fuel that burns dirty. It gets you moving, but it chokes the engine if you don't change blends. I swapped in something steadier: competence, patience, the daily sacrament of showing up. Around 27, I started consulting on the side for a small e-commerce shop whose owner had eyes like a calculator and a heart like a rescue dog. We cut their late shipments in half in a month, which in that world is a love letter. Word spread the way useful things do. I was not special, I told myself. I was simply paying attention in a marketplace where attention is rare. When I turned 29, I signed papers that made a thing of my own. Hale Operations occupied a cheap unit in a business park that smelled like paint and optimism. The sign on the door was vinyl and honest. Our first client sold pet supplies. Our second made novelty mugs. Our third moved medical devices and taught me more about compliance than any course ever had. I hired a dispatcher who corrected my typos like that was a form of love, and a warehouse lead who could hear a misaligned pallet with his eyes closed. We were small, which meant we were personal. When a storm knocked out a route, I drove a van myself and delivered packages like penance. When a vendor tried to push bad pallets onto us, I sent them back with an email that read like a polite brick. We kept promises. That's rarer than you think. I didn't watch my father's orbit, not on purpose. But rumors travel. A neighbor from the old block saw me at the grocery store and mentioned that Lionel had expanded into ventures where the books did magic tricks. An old schoolmate said he'd seen Cole around town dressed like success and acting like approval could be a sport. None of it surprised me. When a foundation is poured crooked, the house can be beautiful and still fall. I had stopped wishing for their invitations. I had started wishing for their distance. The first time a client introduced me in a conference room as the person who makes our chaos behave, I felt the kind of pride that doesn't need to be witnessed. Later, alone in the office, I sat on the floor because the chairs hadn't arrived and stared at the bare wall where someday a calendar would scold me. I thought about the door that closed and the other door that opened the one inside my chest. The math wasn't elegant, but it added up. There were setbacks plenty. A software update that tanked our scanners for half a day. A landlord who tried to raise the rent mid-lease and learned I read every line. A client who ghosted on an invoice. We survived by eating noodles and humor for a month. I learned the difference between growing and bursting. I chose growing. On Fridays, my friends still stacked their phones in a bowl. We argued about pizza toppings with the fervor of philosophers and watched movies until the dialogue gave up. Sometimes after they left, I stood by the sink with the lights off and let gratitude rinse the tired out of me. It wasn't dramatic. It was the opposite of dramatic. It was what I had wanted when I was 19, and the porch light blinked out behind me, a life built from inside jokes and calendars, and the sacred fact of rent paid on time. I won't pretend the past didn't knock. Memory is an excellent locksmith. It can open any door you think you've sealed. There were nights when a phrase my father used to say crept up the stairs of my mind and tried to sit on my couch. I let it for a minute the way you let an old injury forecast the rain. Then I asked it to leave. Most of the time, it listened. The day the storm I had chosen to ignore reached my weather, the morning started gray and practical. I was headed into the office with a paper cup and a to-do list that required good knees. The phone buzzed on the passenger seat with a number I didn't recognize. It was longer than usual, the kind of number that looks like it belongs to a building. I almost let it ring out of habit. Then I thought about suppliers and deliveries and the way emergencies dress up as strangers. I swiped to answer. Evan. The voice on the other end was thinner than memory, like it had been ironed too many times. The breath between syllables rasped against something metal. I didn't say anything. The light turned green. Nobody honked. I need your help, the voice said. And in that instant, the map of the last 10 years folded, and a door I thought I'd bricked over trembled in its frame. Evan, the voice repeated. It's me. The traffic moved around me like a slow river. I pulled into a lot that sold mulch year-round and parked between two pyramids of bagged soil. How did you get this number, I asked. He ignored the question. He always did. They've got me in here like an animal. You've got a company now, Resources. You can post bond talk to someone, push a button. You have to. There it was, the old imperative dressed in a new uniform. Somewhere on his end, a door clanged. My father had never needed a sound effect before. I don't have to do anything, I said, and the calm in my voice surprised me. He tried a different key. Family Evan. Your blood. You don't leave blood behind. Blood left me on a porch, I said, and ended the call. The phone rang again that afternoon and the next day and the week after that. Sometimes he was furious. You owe me. Sometimes he was wounded. You're my son. Sometimes he was strategic. Help me out and I'll make it worth your while. He cycled through tactics like a magician with only 3 tricks and a room full of skeptics. I didn't answer every time. When I did, I let him talk until the words collapsed under their own weight. Then I hung up before the reflex to explain could wake up in me. It's a learned skill, not explaining. News traveled the way it always does in a town that likes its gossip dressed as concern. A former classmate texted a link with a headline that ran on a little too long about a multi-layered fraud apparatus. The article had numbers that didn't care about anyone's feelings. Wire fraud, embezzlement, financial statements taught to lie. There were names in there I recognized and one I didn't want to call. The piece said person of interest. I tried not to read it twice. I also did something I never would have admitted at 19. I asked for help on purpose. Years earlier, at a logistics conference where the coffee tasted like ink, and the lanyards made everyone look pre-approved. I'd sat next to a man named Derek Shu. He'd done time in alphabet agency work before becoming a private consultant, companies hired to keep their paperwork legal and their consciences plausible. We had swapped cards because professionals do that, and then for no reason I could name, we'd kept in touch. If you ask me now, I'll say luck favors the stubborn who also keep their address books tidy. I emailed Derek 3 lines. Complicated family situation. Federal charges, not mine. Can I buy you coffee? He replied with a time and an address. No questions in between. The relief I felt was embarrassingly physical. We met in a bakery that believed butter was a moral category. Derek wore the same expression he'd had at the conference alert without being hungry. I told him the outline father schemes calls from a facility whose number was starting to feel like a second ringtone. I did not perform my childhood for him. He didn't ask. He sketched the system on a napkin like a freight flow investigation indictment plea sentencing. Fraud cases, he said, stack on paper. That's both their strength and their weakness. Prosecutors love documents. Judges love guidelines. Defense loves a story. But if the paper is tall enough, the story gets smaller. I asked the question I didn't want to need, answered. How long? Depends on count's cooperation history. But from what's public, 5 is merciful. Could have been more. I stared at the napkin. The number 5 sat there like a block you could lift or trip over. Derek sipped his coffee. You don't strike me as vengeful. I'm not, I said, and was startled to find the statement true. I just don't want to be tricked again. Then learn the rules of the room you're in. He tapped the napkin. Nobody pushes a button here. There are procedures. If he's telling you otherwise, he's selling fog. He gave me a few practical scripts: how to route calls to voicemail, how to decline to discuss ongoing matters without engaging, how to recognize a manipulation wrapped in filial piety. He did not tell me to forgive. He did not tell me to fight. He gave me options and the respect to choose among them. It felt like standing in front of shelves where things had labels. Back at the office, the work kept moving. Freight does not pause for personal epiphanies. A client's launch calendar shifted. We rebuilt their pick map. A carrier changed a line haul. We split routes and called it elegant. I took a meeting with Westbrook Logistics, a national player my father had once paraded as nearly landed. We were a sliver compared to them, but they'd heard we were good at thorny last mile. In a few zip codes other companies treated like a dare. We signed a pilot. It felt like stealing a scene from someone else's movie and making it play better. When my father called that night, I let him speak until he reached the part where he loved me as long as I was useful. Then I offered him a single polished truth. Do you remember Westbrook? I asked. Silence, the kind you can taste. They're a client, I said. They wanted someone dependable. They came to me. I could hear his breath change shape. I pictured the way he used to lean back when a conversation slipped out of his control, as if distance could fix gravity. You always wanted to impress a mirror, I said. Not cruel, just done. I decided to impress a schedule. He reached for anger and missed. You think this makes you a man? I think keeping promises makes me one, I said, and ended the call. Over the next few weeks, I did something petty and precise. I allowed the facts of my work to travel. Not bragging, I'm not built for that. Just the ordinary updates that people pick up like riverstones and carry downstream. Westbrook extended our pilot. A medical devices client renewed. A regional seller asked if we could run 2 more routes because their map liked us. None of that would have mattered to my father if he had been the kind of man who measured success by the satisfaction of the people he served. But he wasn't, which is why it mattered. The calls kept coming smaller now, like pebbles instead of rocks. Sometimes he tried to scare me with shadows, unnamed men, vague threats, the dungeon he imagined for himself transposed onto me. Sometimes he tried to buy me with promissory notes. He had no authority to write favors. Introductions, ghosts of future generosity. The afternoon I decided to answer one last time, I rehearsed nothing. I'd learned that practiced speeches are less useful than honest sentences. He began with the plea I had memorized. I can't stay in here. You don't understand these people. You chose those people, I said, every day for years. I chose to build, he said, and managed to make the words sound like a knife. You built a trap you liked living in. I built a family. I thought of Marina's sighs packaged as counsel, of Cole's smirks rehearsed into approval, of the envelope that vanished and the line of credit that arrived like a verdict. You built an audience, I said. I stepped off stage. He tried one more angle, the oldest one. Son, stop, I said gently. You don't get to use that word as a crowbar. The line went quiet. I could hear paper somewhere and then metal again, a door complaining or a tray. Do you remember the night you held the door? I asked. 19. Backpack. Porch light. You said I was drag dead weight. You told yourself a story where I was disposable. He exhaled through his nose, a sound he'd taught me to fear. It didn't land. That door closed, I said, and another one opened. I'm the one who carries the key now. It does not fit the lock you're rattling. Evan, he said, almost my name, almost a prayer. No, I said, and the word was finally the size I needed it to be. I won't move money. I won't call favors. I won't step back into a room where my name is a tool for someone else's hands. I keep promises here. You taught me what it feels like when promises are broken. That was your contribution. I didn't hang up. I let the silence do the last work. It's a better closer than anger. When I ended the call, the room was as it had been: two monitors, a plant that needed more sunlight, a whiteboard that scolded kindly. But the air had been rearranged. I sat for a long minute and watched nothing happen. Peace is not cinematic. It is the absence of a soundtrack. After that, I stopped answering. The facility could leave messages. I didn't need to collect them. On good days, I forgot to check my voicemail at all. On bad days, I listened for 3 seconds and deleted them before the old reflexes could knot themselves into an argument. On a Tuesday, Derek sent a one-line text, sentencing posted 60 months. I replied with a thank you and an emoji that looked diplomatic. There was nothing to celebrate. There was nothing to mourn either. There was a fact, and I lived beside it. Work kept being work. A junior dispatcher botched a handoff. We fixed it and talked about why. A driver's mom got sick. We rebuilt his week so he could sit in a waiting room and pretend the chairs were comfortable. I started running again slowly, the way I do everything until I can do it faster. The city rerouted a bus, and for 2 weeks the warehouse exit was a puzzle. We solved it by leaving earlier and inventing a joke about fate's sense of humor. At night, the past knocked less often. When it did, I let it sit for a minute and then asked it to leave. Memory, like any guest, learns the house rules. Every so often, a neighbor from the old street would cross my path at the hardware store or the pharmacy and tilt a conversation towards sympathy with a reporter's nose. Such a shame, they'd say, meaning my father's mugshot. Family is family, they'd add, as if the phrase were a universal solvent. I smiled in a way that didn't invite continuation. If people want a parable, they will write one with or without your help. One evening, as the office thinned out and the strip mall lights blinked concession, my phone lit up with a number I recognized too well. I turned it face down and kept working. It buzzed again, then stopped, then buzzed from a different number. I silenced that one too. Power is not a speech. It is a habit. An hour later, a third call arrived, not from the facility. Not a long string of digits, but a local number. I would have known, even if you'd shuffled the order, the house where the porch light had learned to blink off. I didn't answer. I watched the screen until it went dark and left it face down on the desk. Out in the lot, a delivery van rumbled like somebody else's problem resolving itself. The next morning, a headline would change the weather. But for the length of that quiet minute between rings, all I had to do was breathe and choose again the life built from schedules, small mercies, and doors I open only from my side. The next morning, the headline arrived like a change in barometric pressure. Local business heir indicted in fraud conspiracy. There was Cole's name spelled correctly for once, set among verbs that didn't blink, conspired, laundered, falsified. The article used the phrase pattern and practice, which is newspaper for this, wasn't an accident. There were photos, a courthouse door, a suit that fit him too well, a mouth arranged for contrition. I closed the tab without scrolling to the comments. I had nothing to contribute to a chorus that had just discovered a song I'd been hearing since childhood. By noon, my phone lit with the same number that had rung the night before, the house with the blinking porch light. I let it ring twice, 3 times, and then answered, because choosing silence only matters if I also choose when to speak. Evan. My mother's voice had the softness of a bandage that sticks to the wound. It's complicated. Your brother, he made mistakes, but family is family. You need my agreement more than my help, I said, not unkindly. We didn't raise you to turn your back, she said, as if memory were a leash. You didn't raise me, I said. You supervised my father. There was a long inhale, the sound of an old script ruffling its pages. He's still your brother. He is, I said. And you're still my mother. Those words describe a history. They don't guarantee a future. I kept my voice level as if I were explaining a delivery window. I hope Cole tells the truth. I hope he finds a life on the other side of it. That's the kindest form of hope I have. She tried one more turn of the key. If your father were home, he'd know what to do. He is home, I said, and ended the call. He's exactly where his choices live. After the indictment came the pleas. And after the pleas came the sentences, a calendar rearranged by a judge's mouth. Time took its shape without asking us for notes. At the warehouse, we rebalanced shifts. At the office, we onboarded 2 new clients and learned their quirks. One sent POs at 3 a.m., the other apologized by sending pastries. I answered emails. I cleared docs. I watered the plant I kept forgetting to move closer to the window. Nothing cinematic, which is how you know you're healing. 5 years is both forever and a lunch break. The day Lionel's term ended, a former neighbor texted a photo she shouldn't have taken, a man with my father's posture, but not his width, his shoulders pitching forward like a tent after the poles are tired. Rumor said employers didn't return his calls. Rumor said he learned what it felt like to be measured by the promises you kept. Rumor for once sounded like justice practicing its scales. We saw each other by accident because cities are small at the worst possible times. I was leaving the office with a folder under my arm and a grocery list in my head. He stood across the street by the bus stop where the schedule lies cheerfully to everyone. He noticed me notice him. For a breath, we were 2 men staged on opposite sides of a crosswalk, an old scene that didn't know its lines anymore. He lifted his hand half an inch as if to wave or to confess. The gesture looked heavy. In the pause, I took attendance of my own body. No spike of adrenaline, no adolescent heat, no courtroom speech assembling in my throat, just the steady metronome of being alive on a Tuesday. I didn't cross. I didn't look away either. I gave him the kind of nod you give a stranger whose story you aren't auditioning for. Then I unlocked my car, set the folder on the passenger seat, and drove. The light changed behind me. He stayed on the curb. I didn't check the mirror for meaning. That evening, my friends came over with too much food and their phones went obediently into the bowl. Luis argued that pineapple on pizza is a moral imperative. The nurse from upstairs rolled her eyes and brought out a cake that forgave everything. We ate at my table, then on the floor, then standing up by the sink. Someone spilled salsa. We laughed because that's what you do with small disasters. You turn them into stories you can survive. Later, when the door closed behind the last friend and the house exhaled, I walked the rooms the way you inspect a warehouse at end of shift. Counters cleared. Promises kept. I opened the back door and let the evening in. The neighborhood practiced its night noises, a bus sighing 2 streets over, a dog deciding on an opinion, a television negotiating with a wall. My phone was quiet without effort. People think closure is a verdict. Mostly, it's a practice. It's the habit of unlocking the same door every day from the inside. It's choosing the work that lets you sleep. It's keeping your name where only you can sign it. In the morning, there would be bills to pay, a driver to cover for a doctor's appointment, a client who wanted something rushed without paying rush. There would be coffee and a root board and a stack of tote labels and somebody's birthday to forget until the cupcake appears. There would be a life, which is what revenge becomes when you stop feeding it and start feeding yourself. On my way to bed, I paused at the front door. The lock turned easily smooth from 1,000 repetitions. For a second, I remembered another door, another hand, another sentence that had tried to reduce me to ballast. Memory knocked, and I let it stand there, then watched it choose the porch over the living room. The quiet that followed wasn't empty, it was earned. I switched off the light and said the truth out loud, not for anyone else to hear, but because the house liked the sound of it. I was never the burden. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story. I'll see you next time as we continue exploring more journeys and lessons together.